Hello everyone, version 3 has come out a bit ago and has come with some very impactful changes. However, the changes have been pretty confusing. Were they buffs or actually nerfs? Now, I wish I could get this video a bit sooner, but as of me reading my intro, I've likely spent 30 hours in the past 2 days on the math and script alone. So although it'll be a bit late, I'm at least very certain with the stuff I'm about to say. With that said, let's get right into it. Starting with Himeko, the most important change you need to know deals with her energy and subsequently light code. Prior to version 3, assuming we could do both extra assist skills per rotation, we would always be able to manage a 2-turn ult rotation, whether or not you had S1. This would apply to her two main teams of form swapping and solo verdict with Sunday. However, post version 3, her assist skills now generate less energy, but this was made up with her gaining 5 energy at the start of each turn. However, her ult cost also got increased from 140 to 50, thus making her not able to 2-turn ult cleanly. This was unfortunately pushed into her light cone. Now, anytime Himeko casts an assist skill, she gains 6 energy, thus making it so we get a perfect 2-turn ult rotation. Now at a glance, this seems like a big deal, as they're basically locking her kid behind a paywall. However, in reality, this energy is actually omega overrated. And this is because, in the grand scheme of things, this energy actually doesn't do too much. We basically just pull everything back one turn, which generally speaking, isn't too impactful. Think about it like this. Because we're getting 6 energy per assist skill, that'll take 25 assist skills to gain 1 extra ult, which depending on your team, is after your 9th rotation. And in MOC terms, you'll get an extra ult after 6 entire cycles, which by the way should never happen. But assuming you do, that's maybe around a 4% damage increase. Now prior to version 3, her signature light cone was an egregious stat stick, and would result in Himeko gaining a 54% raw damage increase compared to her free-to-play option. By the way, this will vary based on her teammates, but within her best in slot, it was around 54%. Then this is an insane stat as most signature light cones often range at 20% and peak at 35%. Now, with Himeko's new light cone removing that 40% attack and some damage bonus, that results in a 17% decrease. As such, instead of a 54% increase, it's now just a modest 28%. So, for free-to-play players, this is an omega win, and that's because we'll be seeing those missing numbers in our base kit. In other words, they nerfed the light cone and made it seem mandatory, but in reality, it's not. And in turn, they shifted a lot of that power into her base kit. So with that in mind, let's cover her base kit, which had some very interesting changes. To start off, her skill got a slight nerf, losing 10% damage bonus, but in turn, her talent got an additional 50 crit damage to herself. In other words, her assist skills would have gained 33 crit damage, while her ult would have lost 16.7 crit. In total, it's a buff. However, what's crazy is the next part. Himeko's verdict, or ult form, instead of giving herself only 200 ult crit damage, it's now 100 universal damage bonus and an additional 100 for her ult. At the same time, Himeko's decimation or skill form now gives an additional 50 crit damage to all allies and another 50 to all skills, for a total of a 200 crit damage buff. As you could assume, really solid buffs. The question is though, how good is this actually, and is it as game breaking as some people are making it out to be? Well, to analyze this, we need to look at it within a vacuum and also within context. In a vacuum, it's overall great changes. When we convert the damage bonus into crit, we can see that all of these got sizable buffs, with Verdict now getting 4 times the amount of stats that it once did. With that in mind, when we adjust the crit values by the 75-25 skill to ult damage distribution, wow, that's a lot to say, we can see that Verdict only actually ends up ahead of Decimation form. This of course is super surprising as ults only make up 25% of her total damage. Of course swapping around is the best, but at this point only by a small margin. Now when we look at the damage gain via these buffs, starting with her skill and decimation form, assuming we started with 200 crit damage, version 3's talent and decimation buff led to a 33% increase in her assist skill's damage, which is massive and a great thing for free-to-play players. As for her ult, this massive damage bonus buff leads to a 18.33% damage decrease. Yep, a damage loss. By the way, it took me so long to figure out what the hell was going on. For you, it'll be like 5 seconds, but for me, it was a few hours. And the reason for this will be because she has a whopping 453 starting base damage bonus in her current best in slot team. So, with her getting all that damage bonus in her verdict form, it'll actually result in a damage loss. By the way, this is within the context of Welt and Blade as her teammates, which provide a lot of damage bonus. In other team variations, which may be filled with crit instead, the results will change, so please keep this part in mind. But when combining these two facts, it'll still result in a 20% damage increase for her base kit. Now, while I normally like looking at the raw implications, I've realized that understanding both scenarios will give us the best interpretation. Now, the final change to pair with this is that her ult was slightly buffed in terms of MVs, but because her ults were generally 1/4 of the team's damage, it results in around a 1 to 4% damage increase depending on the amount of enemies. So when combining this alongside her Lyco nerf and a talent buff, for E0S1, it's roughly hovering around a 3% damage increase compared to version 1. However, for non-SIG users, it'll be roughly a 24% increase for Himeko, which again is awesome. Now, before concluding, I do want to go over her best team and form post version 3. Without getting into the math, only decimation leads to a 5% damage decrease, while only verdict is around a 9% decrease. So in a team with both Welt and Dan Heng, we can say that if only Welt were to press the assist skill instead of Dan Heng, that would be roughly equal to 4% more damage. Now this kinda sucks because in my opinion, I thought switching forms was super cool and added a lot of skill expression to it. But now you could just have Welt press the assist skill and it'll basically be optimal. Now this is great for auto battle, but again, less skill expression does suck. To summarize everything for Himeko though, 1. Her Lycone got nerfed, but this was transferred to her base kit. 2. Accounting for her Lycone and base kit buffs, her power level has remained around the same for S1, but buffed for S0 in her best in slot teams. If you opt to use allies that don't really give damage bonus, then it actually is a sizable buff. As for additional things, A. Any defense shredders or alternate buffers are just fantastic, such as Welt, Blade, and even Tree. B. Sunday's Verdict only team has 37% higher multipliers, but deals 62% less damage. Viable, but not optimal at the moment. However, if Sunday were to get the Sparkle treatment, then I have no doubt that he would be best in slot and replace Blade. C. Himeko can indeed be a sub DPS or OK support. I will cover teams more in depth in the future, but today we're just looking at the changes. And in terms of tier list, she's gonna go from tier 0 to tier 0. So with that finished up, let's move on to a quick intermission with Rin. Rin on the other hand has gotten nerfed, which has people saying she's gotten touched or her main DPS potential is dead. Thankfully that's not quite true. To start off, I want to look at her supportive capabilities for Archer, which have been slightly adjusted. Firstly, she now has 2 trigger conditions for the joint attack. The first is still Archer shooting a shot at under 3 SP, but now it'll also launch after he shoots 5 consecutive times. This is a nice change and will help Archer in situations where he has too much SP and cannot cross that threshold. More importantly though, her amp has been adjusted. Her talent now gives 30 less crit damage, which for an Archer inside his best in slot team, we effectively dropped from 530 to 500 crit damage, making this change result in around a 5% damage loss. For the next 2 things, her Trace 1 now gives 10% pen instead of 20% defense shred, but her Lycone however has had its supportive capabilities buffed from 10% AoE defense shred to now 20%. Assuming Archer is on a Genius set and Rin is S1, pre-version 3 it was a 24.1% damage increase, but post-version 3 it's now 25.6%, so a 1% damage increase. However, for E0 users, we've lost around 6% in terms of amp. Overall, she's still a fantastic support for Archer. At E0S1, she's now roughly 30% stronger than E0 Tribi, and at S0, it's now just 25%. Overall, she's still by far his best support when we combine it with all the SP she's making. So moving on, it's time for her main DPS capabilities. Thankfully, this part is super easy and we can just look at the MVs. The only meaningful change was to her enhanced skills MVs. Instead of the scaling being 90 plus 90Y, it's now 80 plus 80Y. Overall, this would result in a 11% damage decrease. So, combining this with the slight light cone buff and crit damage nerf, her main DPS and also sub DPS capabilities has been nerfed by around 15%. All in all, it's not too big of a deal. Her main DPS playstyle was always her niche version. But I'd say with this change, while her supportive capabilities still make her tier 0, her main DPS version I'd say still likely remains in around tier 0.5 to tier 1. And finally, Gilgamesh. His reception has been quite mixed to say the least. Some are happy with the changes and believe he's now a solid main DPS, while others are upset that his synergy with Saber got cooked. So I'll answer. What did the changes actually do? Were they buffs or actually nerfs in disguise? Well, they reduced his ult cost by 40% and balanced this by nerfing his Trace 1's energy gain from 80 to 30%. In theory, it was to remove the infinite damage combo that was caused by Saber when paired with RMC. Less total energy equals less mem charge for the loop to occur. However, the nerf was not proportional to the damage decrease in energy. Instead of a 1-to-1 conversion, we're now getting our ult 37% slower. However, this change was counteracted by Gilgamesh gaining higher MVs for both his skill and ult. His skill now does 40% more damage, while his ult gained a 76% increase in single target, 38% in 3 target, and 25% in 5 target. All in all, the energy nerf was indeed compensated by the damage increase via the raw multipliers, especially in single target. His own skills now also generate a higher percentage of this energy, so he on average should be dealing ever so slightly more damage than version 1 and 2. However, his Trace 3 amps got nerfed and now gives the team 40% less attack and crit, which was partially offset by Trace 2, with Gilgamesh gaining 25 more crit damage. In total, 40% attack and 15 crit damage was lost. Doing my crit damage conversion for simplicity's sake, we can say that losing these stats would result in roughly a 15% damage decrease, which is in line with what happened to Himeko's Lyco. So to address this claim, Gil is not a Saber slave anymore and can be a main DPS. The truth is that nothing really changed in this regard, and Gilgamesh is now slightly weaker in both cases. While Gilgamesh will have higher screenshot damage, his actual damage output will be below his prior kit. So when looking at posts celebrating version 3 or a main DPS buff, I'm sorry, but that's unfortunately not what happened. Now, I've seen quite a bit of damage bars showing how Gilgamesh is now doing a higher percent of the team's damage in his current Hypercarry and Saber team, which is true, but it's not because he's doing more damage, but it's because his allies are doing less. Now, the final change I've been saving will be the joint attack. With the prior changes listed, I do believe the infinite combo would have still been possible at E0S1. As such, they had to giga adjust this aspect to make sure it was dead. I originally was gonna break it all down, but it will actually take way too long, so I'll just give you the on-paper TLDR. 40% higher multipliers, but 33%-ish longer time to charge. And instead of 200 energy and 25% action advance for Saber, she'll now instead get 120 energy, with her ults now dealing double the damage. For this part, instead of estimating the changes, I just went ahead and calculated new rotations for Saber. By the way, this was genuinely mind-boggling hard to do as I had to count for his talent, join follow-up attack and actions, while trying to see how much energy Saber had. But doing so, in terms of raw MVs, I believe Saber's lost more than half of it going from version 2 to 3. And this is because instead of being able to do a full combo on every single turn, it's now instead a full combo once every 3 turns. And even with her ult dealing double the damage, it doesn't really make up this fact. And this is genuinely the hardest nerf I've ever seen in a beta. Anaxa, Cypher, Ashfield, all child's play compared to this. But the question is, was it warranted? In terms of raw MVs, Saber would have gained roughly a 400% increase, or around 4 times her current life damage compared to version 2. Now, part of me thinks, yeah, sounds fair, Saber is kinda dookie right now, but then I remember we have units like Herta or Aglaya also at tier 1, and if they were to get 4 times the amount of actions, then it probably would be pretty game breaking. And this is also before considering how our team's getting effectively a second main DPS with Gilgamesh's personal damage. Speaking of which, Gil's MVs in my scenario will be at 22k, which when compared to Saber, he's contributing to roughly half of the team's damage. And when looking at gameplay and damage charts, this does line up. So with that done, and to conclude, Gilgamesh's actual damage output should have remained relatively the same from version 2 to 3. However, due to his buffs being nerfed, it ended up as a overall damage loss for all of his teams. And while the Saber Infinite combo got removed from them, the two are both still very competent DPSs. Now in my opinion, I'd personally put the Saber and Gilgamesh team at tier 0, albeit the lower end of it. So yeah, pretty dang strong even after the nerfs. And yeah, that's the video. It was an omega doozy to make this time around, as I kept seeing conflicting opinions in math regarding this topic, so I was doubting my math because it was so conflicting with what other people got. But having listed out the changes, I'm very certain that my analysis is correct. For example, I saw some people say that S1 Himeko got a 20% damage increase using the same team that I was using, but with what I explained in the video, that's just not possible. Now, as for the future, my next video is either going to be a theory one or something similar to the Blade one I made a while back. But if y'all have any cool ideas or whatnot, I'll be sure to yoink them. Also, by sheer coincidence guys, a good IRL friend of mine somehow knew the creator Alpaca deck, and we eventually got in touch via Discord. It's a crazy small world out there. So in the coming days, there probably will be a collab or something, but I'll have to figure out the details too. But besides that, thank you guys so much for watching, and peace.